Have you ever felt like your own brain is actively trying to protect you from being yourself?
Oh, absolutely. It's a very real, very intense phenomenon.
Right. It's this incredibly disorienting experience where you know exactly who you are deep down, but the moment you try to actually step into that reality, your mind just like floods your system with pure unfiltered panic.
Yeah, it creates a devastating kind of an internal gridlock because you are essentially caught between a profound psychological truth and, well, an overwhelming biological fear response.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are looking at a deeply psychological text that maps out this exact internal conflict.
And it's a heavy one, but so incredibly insightful.
Definitely. Specifically, the source material explores the intersection of trauma and gender identity. It's written as a framework to help trans women and feminine-aligned people navigate the really heavy, complicated journey of accepting their girlhood when past trauma is creating massive internal resistance.
And I want to clarify right up front, our goal for this deep dive isn't to, take a stance or endorse anything politically. We are just objectively exploring the author's fascinating psychological concepts.
Exactly. We're just reporting on what the text says.
Right, because the way the text separates the lingering, often deceptive effects of trauma from a person's core identity, it holds some profoundly valuable insights for you, the listener, about how we all process deeply held aspects of ourselves.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the author identifies this core conflict right at the beginning. It's that agonizing dissonance of knowing you are a girl while simultaneously being terrified of that very fact.
Yeah, and the text advises that the very first step in untangling this isn't to fight the fear.
Which is usually our first instinct, right? To just fight it.
Exactly. But the author says you have to acknowledge the conflict without judgment. You literally have to allow both versions of reality to sit in the same room.
The part of you that knows your truth and the part of you that is terrified of it.
Right, because if you try to forcefully evict the fear, you're actually just fighting your own nervous system. And that is a battle you will lose every time.
Wow. Yeah.
The text makes a crucial distinction here. It asks the reader to recognize that fear and resistance are historical responses. They are echoes of past experiences, where expressing femininity might have resulted in, rejection, danger, or pain.
They aren't reflections of your actual inherent identity right now.
Precisely.
Reading through this, the way the author describes the physical and emotional sensation of that fear, it honestly sounds like a hijacked security system.
Oh, I like that comparison.
Like imagine you buy a house with a hypersensitive smoke detector. You're just trying to make toast in the morning, which is a perfectly normal, safe, mundane thing to do.
But the alarm starts blaring.
At deafening volumes, and when that alarm goes off, your heart races, your palms sweat, and your body screams at you to flee the building. The panic is entirely real.
But the threat isn't.
Right. The alarm is reacting to a fire that happened years ago, or maybe it's just completely miscalibrated by the previous owner. It's reacting to the past, not reflecting the actual reality of you making toast in the present moment.
What's fascinating here is how that visual perfectly aligns with what the author bluntly summarizes with a very powerful two-word phrase, trauma lies.
Wait, I really want to dig into that. How exactly does it lie? Because when you are in the middle of a panic response, it feels like the absolute truth. What is actually happening in the brain when that happens?
So to understand the text's assertion that trauma lies, we have to look at how the brain fundamentally processes threats.
Okay.
When a person experiences sustained trauma, say, being punished or marginalized for expressing their true gender identity, the amygdala gets completely rewired.
And the amygdala is basically the brain's threat detection center.
Right. Exactly. It starts associating the sheer existence of that identity with an existential threat. So later in life, even when the person is in a perfectly safe environment, the moment they try to embrace their girlhood, the amygdala fires off that alarm.
It completely bypasses logic.
It does. The trauma tells the reader that being a girl is dangerous or painful because of what they survived, not because girlhood itself is inherently bad.
I mean, it's a survival mechanism that has outlived its usefulness. The brain is trying to save your life, but in doing so, it's suffocating your soul.
That's the tragic irony of the trauma response. And it's why the text insists you have to actively separate the trauma's narrative from your identity.
So how do we do that?
Well, the author suggests some very practical psychological exercises to try. One of the first is to literally write down what being a girl currently means to you.
Why write it down? Why not just, think about it?
Because when you're just thinking about it, you are trapped in the emotional centers of the brain where the alarm is actively blaring.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, writing it down physically forces you to engage the prefrontal cortex,
Yeah.
the logical, analytical part of your brain. You start to see the tangled web of associations right there on paper.
You realize, oh, my definition of being a girl is entirely tied up in external expectations, or physical safety, or fear of abandonment.
Exactly. And once you see the lies on paper, the text suggests using grounding affirmations to recode the system. Phrases like, I am not my trauma, I am allowed to be me.
I am allowed to be me. It sounds almost too simple, but when your internal security system is blaring, saying that out loud is a radical act of
It
defiance.
really is.
So we start recognizing these false alarms. But if trauma lies, how does the text suggest we actually separate that fear from our identity? How do we carve out a safe space?
Well, the author essentially gives the reader radical permission to entirely reject the societal blueprint of femininity.
Throw the blueprint away.
Basically, yeah. If the traditional, culturally accepted version of being a woman feels unsafe or overwhelming because it's entangled with past trauma, the text says girlhood isn't a rigid, predefined box you have to cram yourself into.
It is a space you get to architect entirely on your own terms.
Right. You have to look inward and ask, what aspects of being a girl actually feel good in my nervous system?
Maybe it has absolutely nothing to do with external performance or aesthetics. Maybe it's about, I don't know, cultivating an internal softness.
Or a specific kind of creativity. Or finally allowing yourself to tap into your intuition without second-guessing it.
You are redefining the identity based purely on what brings you comfort rather than what society dictates.
Yes.
I have to push back a little here, though, on behalf of the listener who might be living this reality right now.
Sure.
Redefining an entire identity from scratch, completely outside of societal norms, that sounds incredibly exhausting, especially for someone who is already carrying the heavy daily weight of trauma. Does the text expect people to just flip a switch overnight?
That is a very real concern, and the author actually anticipates that exact sense of overwhelm.
Okay, good.
The text counters that pressure by establishing a non-negotiable rule for this process: heal at your own pace. There is zero expectation of flipping a switch.
Because trying to force it would probably just trigger the alarm system again, right?
Exactly. The text is abundantly clear that healing is not linear, and no one has to perform their femininity perfectly or publicly on any specific timeline.
So what does healing at your own pace actually look like in practice, according to the source?
It looks like micro-titration, starting incredibly small. The text recommends finding the lowest stakes environment possible.
Like what?
Well, it could be as simple as wearing an article of clothing that feels affirming while you're completely alone in your bedroom,
Okay, yeah.
or using a name or pronouns exclusively with one or two deeply trusted friends. It's about engaging in small, quiet rituals of self-care that slowly teach your nervous system that this identity does not equal danger.
It's basically about laying down a single brick of safety, making sure it holds your weight, and then maybe laying down another one tomorrow.
Beautifully put. The author also heavily advocates for trauma-informed therapy to help process those deep-seated fears.
And finding peer support, right?
Right.
Other trans women or feminine-aligned people who intrinsically understand the weight of this specific journey.
Yes, community is crucial.
And speaking of laying a foundation, there's a profoundly moving section in the source material about the concept of reclaiming what was stolen.
Oh, this is arguably one of the most vital psychological shifts the text outlines.
Because if your trauma forced you to suppress your identity just to survive your childhood or your environment, the author notes that you likely carry this deep, aching grief over the parts of your life that were literally taken from you.
You are denied normal developmental experiences, social milestones, or just the simple freedom to exist naturally.
Which would have helped you feel at home in your own body.
Right. And the psychological damage of that denial is profound. But the text empowers the reader to proactively take those experiences back. It explicitly states that the timeline hasn't expired.
That's fascinating. You can recreate those denied experiences right now in ways that feel safe and affirming today.
Yes, it's like you are retroactively giving your nervous system the safety and the experiences it was starved of. You are allowed to have the sleepover, or buy the clothes, or explore the aesthetics you weren't allowed to touch 10 years ago.
And the author reiterates that your version of womanhood can be whatever you need it to be to facilitate that healing. It can be strong, soft, wild, mysterious, bold, or nurturing.
The overarching theme is autonomy. You are the author now.
Okay, so that brings up a crucial transition in the text. Once you start taking these micro steps, once you start slowly defining this space in private, how do you eventually transition to existing in the broader world without shrinking? shrinking.
Yeah, how do you hold on to that identity without feeling like being yourself is somehow unimportant or a burden to others?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because human beings are fundamentally wired for social validation. We are a tribal species.
We are. And traumatized brains often over-index on seeking that validation as a survival strategy.
Fawning or people-pleasing to avoid conflict.
Exactly. So to combat this, the author maps out a sort of short version for finding freedom in girlhood, a distinct internal journey with 4 key steps.
Yeah, let's hear them.
The very first step is detaching from external validation. The text insists that your girlhood does not require anyone else's approval, understanding, or validation to be real.
Which means you have to actively decide that your inherent worth is a fact, not a debate.
Right. And that leads to step 2, affirming your worth. The text points out that simply existing as your authentic self, especially in the face of profound trauma, is not a small, quiet thing. It is a massive, courageous assertion of truth.
And this realization naturally propels the reader into the next phase of the journey, which is step 3.
Which is where the entire tone of the source material completely transforms. The focus shifts entirely to the concept of reclaiming joy, finding life in expression, movement, and self-connection.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This was the most striking part of the text for me.
Yeah.
Up until this point, everything we've discussed has been heavily focused on survival. We've been talking about managing fear, analyzing false alarms, creating safe spaces. But the author brilliantly pivots away from a narrative of merely surviving a hostile world and tells the reader to actively find joy and power in one's existence.
To fully appreciate why that pivot is so brilliant, we have to look at why joy is actually terrifying to a traumatized nervous system.
Wait, really? Joy is terrifying.
Absolutely. Think about what joy requires. It requires letting your guard down. It requires being fully present in your body and vulnerable to the moment.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
Yeah, if your brain's security system is stuck in overdrive, screaming at you to scan the horizon for the next threat, relaxing into joy feels like a dereliction of duty.
The traumatized brain screams, if you relax and feel good, you won't see the attack coming.
Precisely. So when the text tells you to reclaim joy, it's not just suggesting you go have a fun afternoon. It's essentially prescribing exposure therapy for your soul.
You are actively teaching your body that it is safe enough to let the armor drop.
Exactly. You are finding life in your identity, not just endurance. And when you can experience that joy, it leads directly to the 4th and final step, seeing yourself as powerful.
Embracing who you are makes you whole, not less. The text is wonderfully clear on this point. You are not diminished by your marginalized identity or your past.
You are magnified by your wholeness.
And building on that idea of incredible power and wholeness, the author takes this reclaimed identity and elevates it to a level that commands absolute reverence. The text uses a very heavy, intentional word to describe this hard-won girlhood. It calls it sacred.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the use of the word sacred is a masterful reframing of the narrative.
Because it sounds religious, right?
It does. But in the context of this source material, sacred doesn't necessarily imply a religious dogma. The text defines it as something that is fundamentally unbraceable, something resilient.
It implies an inherent, intrinsic value that exists completely independent of trauma, immune to external judgment, and entirely beyond societal expectations.
Exactly. It's a word that demands respect. And the text doesn't just throw it out there as a buzzword. It methodically walks you through 5 pillars, 5 reasons why this girlhood is sacred.
Okay, let's break down these pillars.
The foundational reason, the first pillar, is simply because it is yours. The text emphasizes that your femininity isn't a credential you have to earn.
You don't have to prove it, and you certainly don't have to justify it to anyone.
Right. Whether it's expressed loudly and boldly or quietly and internally, it simply is. That undeniable ownership is what makes it sacred.
What really struck me, though, was the second pillar, the connection between sacredness and survival.
Oh, this is huge.
The text points out that if trauma forced you to suppress your identity for years or even decades, the mere fact that you can still feel it within you means it never actually left. It survived. It just waited in the dark for you to return to it.
That level of psychological persistence is remarkable. The author wants the reader to realize that this identity isn't a flaw or a mistake, and it certainly isn't a weakness. It was strong enough to endure whatever horrific circumstances you went through.
This totally upends how we usually talk about trauma and identity. We have this cultural habit of treating the self like a fragile glass vase.
Yeah, that's a very common metaphor.
And trauma is the hammer that shatters the vase into a million pieces, leaving you to spend the rest of your life desperately trying to glue the shards back together so you look somewhat normal again.
It's a very bleak, deficit-based view of healing.
Exactly. But this text suggests something entirely different. If we go back to our analogy of the house with the broken alarm system, the trauma was a hurricane that tore through the property
It ripped off the roof, shattered the windows.
and completely scrambled the security wiring. But your identity isn't the fragile glass in the windows. Your identity is the concrete foundation poured deep into the earth. It survived the storm entirely intact.
It didn't shatter.
No, it was just waiting patiently underneath the rubble for you to clear the debris and start building upon it again. And reclaiming your identity is just you finally walking up to that scrambled alarm panel, typing in your own master code, and taking the house back.
That is a phenomenal evolution of the metaphor. And it connects deeply to the third pillar that text explores: connection to the divine.
Meaning what, exactly?
The author frames femininity as a historical, almost cosmic force of creation, transformation, and deep wisdom. It is an energy of growth and intuition. By embracing it, you're tying yourself to a radiant part of human existence that dwarfs any societal label or temporary trauma response.
And because it is this unbreakable, deeply connected foundation, we arrive at the fourth pillar: it deserves joy.
Yes, we touched on this, but it's worth repeating. You exist to create and feel, not just to endure.
The sacredness of your identity is tied to your absolute right to fully be, to celebrate your true self in the sunlight.
Which brings us to the fifth and final pillar of sacredness: you choose it.
Yes, the power of choice.
Your identity is not a passive affliction. In a difficult world or personal history that made it incredibly dangerous to be yourself, choosing to claim that identity anyway is the ultimate act of defiance.
It is an undeniable truth that you are actively, consciously choosing to inhabit, despite the friction.
Exactly, it's an act of radical self-love.
So what does this all mean? When we step back and synthesize this deep dive, what is the core message we're really walking away with?
I think it's a message of profound, unwavering reassurance.
The text is telling you, the listener, that no matter what your trauma is currently screaming at you, your identity is valid. Even on the hard days when the smoke detector is blaring so loudly you can't hear yourself think, and the fear feels entirely overwhelming.
You are not fundamentally broken. It provides an incredibly empowering framework for viewing the healing process itself. The text leaves us with a potent reminder: choosing your own identity, deliberately and consciously, while still carrying the weight of past pain, isn't just an act of survival.
It is the ultimate act of self-love and profound courage.
It is the definitive acknowledgement that no external force and no historical trauma has the power to erase what is inherently and fundamentally part of you.
It is a stunning testament to the resilience of the human psyche. We started this deep dive talking about that terrible internal gridlock, the murky, invisible nature of psychological wounds, and the false alarms our brains use to try and protect us from ourselves.
It's true, you can't always immediately silence the alarm, and you certainly can't erase the memory of the storm.
But as we've explored today, you can absolutely learn to recognize the lies the trauma tells, and you can definitely feel the unshakable strength of the foundation that survived the wreckage. Which leaves me with a final thought for you to mull over today.
I'm ready.
If our deepest truths are the parts of us that stubbornly survive our hardest traumas, waiting patiently under the rubble for us to return to them, what other unbreakable parts of yourself might just be waiting for you to find them?